Distance and midpoint formulas and circles. The distance formula is used to find the distance between any 2 points on the rectangular coordinate system. And that formula is d is equal to the square root of x sub 2 minus x sub 1 squared plus y sub 2 minus y sub 1 squared. Whenever we use the distance formula, we're always going to use the principal square root or the positive square root because, of course, distance can never be negative. So let's use the distance formula to find the distance between these 2 points. Now remember, anytime we have an ordered pair, the first number is our x and the second number is our y. Okay, and the distance formula is this right here. And so we have x and y sub 2's and sub 1's. So I'm just going to mark these as the first set as my 1's and the second set as my 2's. And it really doesn't matter which ones you choose to be your 1's and your 2's. Okay, so let me plug those into my formula, x sub 2 minus x sub 1. So that would be 1 minus negative 4 squared plus y sub 2 minus y sub 1, and that would be negative 3 minus 9 squared. Okay, so I need to make sure that when I simplify this, I'll follow order of operations, so I'm going to do what's in parentheses first. 1 minus a negative 4 would be the same as 1 plus 4, which would be 5. And negative 3 minus 9 would give me a negative 12. And then when I square those, 5 squared is 25, and negative 12 squared would become a positive 144. And then that gives me the square root of 169, which is 13. Now, usually you won't get a perfect square, so if you don't get a perfect square, just simplify your radical. All right. The midpoint formula is a formula that we use to find the coordinates of the point that is in the middle of 2 other points. So if we have a line segment like this, then of course the 2 endpoints of the line would be at the ends of the line, and then the midpoint formula would tell us what the coordinates of this point here in the middle would be. And that formula, so since we're looking for a coordinate, we're looking for an x and a y. So this formula is going to give us 2 separate numbers. A lot of times students will try to put those numbers together and give a fraction or a single number, but you should get two numbers, 2 answers, because that's your x and your y coordinate. And the formula for the midpoint is x sub 1 plus x sub 2 divided by 2, and y sub 1 plus y sub 2 divided by 2. Now, this formula is pretty easy to remember because all we're doing is we're finding the average between the 2 points. Now, if you'll remember, the way that we find the average of a set of numbers is we add up all the numbers and then we divide them by however many we have. Well, that's what we're doing here. We have 2 x's, we add them together and we divide by 2. We have 2 y's, we add them together and divide by 2, and that gives us the midpoint. Okay, so let's do that with these 2 points. Again, I'm going to label these. This is my x1, my y sub 1, my x sub 2, and my y sub 2. Okay, so for the midpoint, we take our 2 x's and add them together. Okay, so that would be 1 plus 7, and we divide by 2. And then we take our 2 y's and we add them together. 2 plus negative 3, and we divide by 2. Okay, so we want to simplify. 1 plus 7 is 8, divided by 2. And 2 plus a negative 3, that would be negative 1, divided by 2. So anytime we have a fraction, we should always reduce our fraction. And 8 over 2 would reduce to 4. and then 1/2 is already reduced. So that is the coordinates of my midpoint for -1/2. All right, now we're going to talk about circles. The definition of a circle is a set of all points in a plane that are equidistant from a fixed point. That fixed point is the center of your circle, and the distance from that fixed point to any point on the circle is the radius. So the radius is half the distance from the center. Well, it's the distance from the center of the circle to the outside of the circle, so it would be halfway across your circle. If you'll remember, going all the way across the circle, that is the diameter of the circle. This is the equation of a circle, or standard form of the equation of a circle, and it's x minus h squared plus y minus k squared equals r squared. And h and k, the h and the k in this formula, or this equation, is the center of the circle. So the center of the circle, h is the same thing as our x coordinate, and k would be the y coordinate. And that's the center of the circle. And then r represents the radius of the circle. Now, if you will look at this equation, you might notice that it's very similar to an equation that we just talked about. This is the same as the distance formula. If I were to take the square root of the radius and take the square root of the other side, well, square and square root would cancel each other out, so that would just be r. So let's look at it like this. If this is r is equal to all of this, remember the distance formula is d is equal to the square root of x sub 2 minus x sub 1 squared plus y sub 2 minus y sub 1 squared. So it's really the same formula. Now, whenever we are using this standard form of the equation of a circle, let me erase all this writing. Notice that the h and the k are negative in the equation. Okay, so that's going to be important in just a minute when we start trying to pull things out of the equation. But first, let's write the equation given some information. Okay, so for the first set of information that we're given, it tells us that we have a center of 0, 0 and a radius of 4. Okay, so let me go ahead and rewrite that equation of a circle. So it's x minus h squared plus y minus k squared equals r squared. Well, if my center is 0, 0, if I plug in 0 for h, that would just be x minus 0, and then that's squared. Well, x minus 0 is just x, and then it's squared. And then the same thing for the y. Y minus 0, if my k is 0, then that would just be y squared. Equals my radius, which is 4 squared, and 4 squared is 16. So that would be the equation of a circle with a center at 0, 0 and a radius of 4. Okay, so for the next example, we have a center at 5, negative 6 and a radius of 10. Okay, so we're going to have to plug those in. So that would be x minus, and my h is 5 squared, plus y minus, my k is negative 6 squared, and that equals the radius, which is 10 squared. Okay, so let me just clean this up a little bit. X minus 5 squared plus, that would be y plus 6 squared equals 10 squared, which is 100. Okay, so that would be the standard form of the circle. Now, like I said earlier, because of the fact that the signs in our equation are negative, that changes the signs of my h and my k. So in this equation, this formula that we just wrote, we have x minus 5 and y plus 6. But my center is positive 5 and negative 6. So you see it has the opposite sign once we plug it into the equation. In the equation, my 5 looks negative and my 6 looks positive. But my actual center has the 5 positive and the 6 negative. So just be aware of that. And when you're given an equation of a circle and you have to pull out the center, just know that you're going to need to change the signs of those numbers. And it's because we started out with a negative in the equation. Okay, so we're going to do that now. They've given us the equation of a circle in standard form, and they want us to find the center and the radius of the circle. Okay, so in this equation here, if we pull out the center of the circle, we have to change the signs of those numbers. So we have x plus 3, so my h is going to be negative 3. And then we have y minus 1, so my k is going to be a positive 1. And then my radius is going to be the square root of whatever it's equal to. So my radius is 2. Okay, and then this was my center. Okay, and then they want us to graph the circle. Okay, so given this information, the center and the radius, we can graph the circle. The first thing we want to do is plot the point where the center is. So the center is at negative 3, 1, which would be right here. And since my radius is 2, we just need to go 2 spaces away from the center in every direction. So I'm going to go 2 spaces up, 2 spaces to the right, 2 spaces down, and 2 spaces to the left. And then just connect those dots. And that gives me my circle. The last thing we need to do is use the graph to identify the relations domain and range. Okay, so remember for our domain, we want to see how far it goes on the x-axis. So it would go from here to here. And so that means we always, remember for the domain, we always start at the left and go to the right. So the farthest that our circle goes to the left would be negative 5. And then the farthest it goes to the right would be negative 1. Now, since our circle is passing through that point, so it's passing through negative 5 right here, that means that it's included, that number is included. And it's the same thing for our negative 1, it's included. So we're going to use brackets instead of parentheses. And that's how it will always be when we're doing the domain and the range of the circle, because it'll be passing through those points. Okay, so then for the range, we want to know how far up and down it goes. And remember, we always start at the lowest number and go to the highest number. So we're going to start at the bottom and go to the top. So the lowest point that our circle goes is negative 1, and again it's in a bracket, and it goes up to positive 3. And so that would be the range of the circle. All right, in this example it says write in standard form and graph. So they did not give us the circle, the equation of the circle in standard form. So we are going to need to rearrange it and get it in standard form. And the way that we're going to do that is by completing the square. All right, so to complete the square, what we need to do, there's several steps we need to go through. So the first thing we need to do is group together our x terms. So I'm going to write x squared plus 4x. And what we're going to try to do in order to complete the square is write a perfect square trinomial. Okay, so we're going to create a trinomial with our x terms, so we need to have one more term, so I'm going to say plus something, we don't know what it is yet. Okay, those are my x's, and now I need to write my y's. I have a y squared minus 4y, and we're also going to need to add something to that group. Okay, so that's all my x's and my y's, so what I have left is this -1. Well, I need to move that to the other side of the equation. So if I move this -1 to the other side of the equal sign, that's going to become a +1. Okay, so now we need to fill in those blanks. And the way that we figure out what we need to put in those spots is we use this little formula, this little equation, b divided by 2 squared. So if you'll remember, in a quadratic equation in standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Well, this is a quadratic equation and this is a quadratic equation. So in the quadratic equations, whatever term is in front of our x, the coefficient of x, is going to be our b. And that's what we're going to use in this formula. So to figure out what we add to our x group, we do b divided by 2 squared. Well, b in our x group is 4. Okay, so that's 4 divided by 2 squared. Well, 4 divided by 2 is 2, and 2 squared is 4. So that's what we're going to add to our x group. But since this is an equation, we can't just add something to one side of the equation. We have to keep our equation balanced, so we have to add 4 to the other side also. Okay, so then in our y group, we have a -4. So I'm just going to change the sign of that 4 in our little equation up here at the top. Now, -4 divided by 2 would be -2, but once I square it, it becomes a +4. And so that's why I went ahead and put these pluses here, because it's always going to, whatever we add is always going to end up being positive because we have to square it. So this would also be a +4. And again, I have to add the same thing to the other side of the equation. All right, so now we need to factor. But whenever we factor a perfect square trinomial, it's real easy to factor. All we have to do is take the square root of the two ends. Okay, so we're going to take the square root of x squared, which is x, take the square root of 4, which is 2, and then we use whatever the first sign is. So we use this sign right here. All right, so that would be plus in parentheses squared. So if you don't believe me, all you have to do, remember whenever you factor, if you multiply your factors back together, you should get what you started with. So if you were to take x plus 2 and write it twice and and FOIL it, you would get x squared plus 4x plus 4. Okay, so now let's do the same thing with our y group. Okay, so if I take this square root of the two ends, the square root of y squared is y, the square root of 4 is 2, and then we have to use the first sign, we have to use this sign, so this time we have a negative in between the two terms, squared. Okay, and then we just add up all the stuff on the other side of the equal sign, and we get 9. Now our equation of our circle is in standard form, so we can pull out the information that we need to be able to graph our circle. Okay, so for the center of the circle, my h and my k would be, remember we have to change the sign, so my h is -2 and my k is +2. And then the radius is going to be the square root of whatever our equation is equal to. So the square root of 9 is 3. All right, so let's graph the circle. The center is at -2, +2. And then we go 3 spaces in every direction. And then we connect our dots. And that's our circle. Okay, so just to practice, let's go ahead and find the domain and the range of the circle. Okay, so we need to see how far it goes, left and right. Okay, for our domain. And the farthest it goes to the left is -5. And to the right is +1. And for our range, it goes down to -1 and up to +5. Okay, so doing it when it's not in standard form is a little complicated, so let's do one more example. Okay, so we need to go through those steps again. We're going to get our x's together. So we have an x² plus 6x plus something, we don't know yet. And then our y² plus 2y plus something. Equals, we take whatever our constant is and move it over to the other side of the equation. And to move that +1 over, we would have to subtract it, so we get a -1 on the other side of the equation. All right, let's figure out what we need to add to each group. B divided by 2 squared. In my x group, what is my b? It would be 6. Okay, so 6 divided by 2 squared. 6 divided by 2 is 3, and 3 squared is 9. So I need to add 9 to my x group and to the other side of the equation. All right, so then for my y group, what is my b? It's 2. Okay, so 2 divided by 2 squared. Well, 2 divided by 2 is 1, and 1 squared is 1. So I need to add 1 to my y group and add 1 to the other side of the equation. Okay, so you remember how to factor these? We just take the square root of the two ends. The square root of x² is x. The square root of 9 is 3. And we use the first sign, so it's plus. In parentheses squared. Okay, then for my y group, the square root of y² is y. The square root of 1 is 1. In parentheses squared, and then I use that first sign, which is plus. Okay, so then for the other side of the equation, if I combine those terms, the -1 and the +1 would cancel out, and so all I have is 9. So my center of my circle is going to be -3 and -1. All right, and then my radius is the square root of what it's equal to, and the square root of 9 is 3. Okay, so let's graph this circle. -3, -1, and then I go 3 in every direction. And that would be my circle.